The metal shovel hit something that shouldn't have been there, 3 feet beneath the Wyoming snow. Rebecca Walsh's breath caught in her throat as she brushed away the white powder, revealing a small purple mitten still moving weakly in the frigid air. But this wasn't just one child buried beneath the drifts. As she frantically began digging, more tiny hands emerged from the snow, like desperate flowers, reaching toward a sun they might never see again. 15 children buried alive, with hypothermia setting in, and a storm approaching that would seal their fate forever. What happened next would transform a woman running from her darkest nightmare into the guardian angel these forgotten souls had been praying for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Walsh had never imagined that survival could require so many lies. Standing in the bitter December wind at Cheyenne Station, clutching a carpet bag that contained everything she owned and a letter from a man named Daniel Foster, whom she'd never met, she counted the deceptions that had brought her to this frozen platform in the middle of nowhere. Wyoming territory. The first lie was her name. She wasn't Rebecca Walsh from Boston, seeking adventure in the American West. She was Rebecca Porter from Baltimore, fleeing a husband whose definition of love involved bruises that took weeks to heal and threats that kept her awake, listening for his footsteps in the hallway. The bruises had faded during the 5-day train journey across half a continent, but the memory of how she'd gotten them remained as sharp as the wind that now cut through her wool coat. The second lie was in the letters she'd written to Daniel Foster, responding to his advertisement in the Denver Post. She described herself as a woman of independent means, seeking companionate marriage with a respectable rancher, when the truth was that she'd spent her last coins on train fare and forged papers that identified her as someone who had never existed. The transformation from Rebecca Porter to Rebecca Walsh had required more than just a new name. It had demanded the complete reinvention of her personal history, her background, even her dreams for the future. Marcus Porter, the man she'd married 3 years ago in Baltimore, had seemed like salvation when they first met. Handsome, charming, successful in his shipping business, generous with gifts that made other women envious of Rebecca's good fortune. What those women hadn't seen were the private moments when Marcus's charm dissolved into something predatory and dangerous. The way his hands became instruments of control when Rebecca questioned his business practices or expressed opinions that contradicted his own. The nights when she lay in their bed, pretending to sleep while he paced the house like a caged animal, checking doors and windows with the paranoid intensity of someone who expected enemies to materialize from shadows. The end of her marriage had come not through any decision of her own, but through a discovery that had made staying impossible. While cleaning their basement during an October afternoon, when Marcus was supposedly attending to business matters, Rebecca had found a hidden room behind a false wall. The space contained evidence of activities that had nothing to do with legitimate shipping operations. Crates of goods that bore no customs stamps, jewelry that matched descriptions of pieces reported stolen from Baltimore's wealthiest families. Most disturbing of all, documents that appeared to be forged immigration papers, complete with official-looking seals and signatures that Rebecca suspected were not authentic. When Marcus discovered her in the basement that evening, standing among the evidence of his criminal enterprises, his reaction had been swift and terrifying. The beating that followed left her with cracked ribs, a concussion that took days to heal, and the absolute certainty that remaining in Baltimore would eventually cost her life. But leaving Marcus Porter hadn't been as simple as packing her belongings and purchasing train tickets. Men like Marcus had resources, connections, and the kind of ruthless determination that made them pursue what they considered their property, regardless of distance or obstacles. Rebecca had needed more than escape. She had needed to become someone else entirely, someone who existed beyond Marcus's reach and understanding. The solution had emerged through careful research conducted during furtive visits to Baltimore's public library, where she studied newspaper advertisements from Western territories and learned about the possibilities available to women willing to travel far enough from their problems. Marriage advertisements appeared regularly in papers from Denver, Salt Lake City, San Francisco, and dozens of smaller settlements where men outnumbered women by ratios that created opportunities for those brave enough to seize them. But not all of these opportunities were legitimate, and Rebecca had quickly learned to recognize the difference between genuine offers of partnership and situations that might prove as dangerous as what she was fleeing. Daniel Foster's advertisement in the Denver Post had stood out for its straightforward honesty rather than elaborate promises. Widowed rancher 38 seeks honest woman for companionate marriage. Remote location offers privacy and security for someone seeking a new beginning, far from Eastern complications. Must be prepared for challenging conditions, but will find mutual respect and fair treatment. The tone suggested a man who understood that women answering such advertisements might be running from something, and who offered sanctuary rather than exploitation. Their subsequent correspondence had revealed Daniel Foster to be exactly what his advertisement suggested: a practical man who needed domestic partnership to help manage a cattle operation in Wyoming's remote Bighorn Basin. He had lost his wife to pneumonia 2 years earlier, leaving him to manage both ranch operations and care for the couple's infant son. He offered marriage not as romance, but as mutual assistance, a business arrangement that could benefit both parties while providing the legal protections that formal marriage offered to women in precarious circumstances. Rebecca's letters to Daniel had been carefully crafted to reveal enough truth to establish genuine connection while concealing details that could endanger her if Marcus ever managed to trace her correspondence. She had written about her desire for a simpler life away from eastern cities, her willingness to work hard in exchange for security and respect, her understanding that frontier marriage required practical partnership rather than romantic fantasy. She had not written about Marcus Porter, about the hidden room filled with stolen goods, about the bruises that had finally healed during her journey west. The financial arrangements for their marriage had been straightforward and generous. Daniel had sent money for train fare from Boston to Cheyenne, along with additional funds for appropriate clothing and supplies for Wyoming winter conditions. He had also provided detailed directions to his ranch, located 40 miles north of Cheyenne in a country he described as isolated but beautiful, challenging but rewarding for those willing to embrace its demands. Standing now on the platform at Cheyenne Station, Rebecca realized that Daniel Foster's failure to meet her train might indicate problems more serious than simple delays caused by weather. The December blizzard that had been building during the final hours of her journey was now creating conditions that made travel dangerous even for experienced frontiersmen. The station master, a grizzled man named Pete Williams, who had clearly spent decades dealing with stranded travelers, confirmed her fears with characteristic frontier bluntness. Foster's ranch is a hard day's ride in good weather, Williams explained as he helped Rebecca carry her carpet bag into the station house. In conditions like this, most folks with any sense stay put until the storm passes. Could be Daniel's holed up somewhere between here and there, waiting for visibility to improve. The prospect of remaining stranded at Cheyenne Station filled Rebecca with anxiety that had nothing to do with physical discomfort. Every day she remained in one location increased the possibility that Marcus's people might track her down. She had chosen Wyoming specifically because its remoteness would make pursuit difficult, but that remoteness was meaningless if she never reached her intended destination. Is there any way to get to Foster's ranch without waiting for him to come here? Rebecca asked. Though she suspected the answer would discourage such attempts, Williams studied her city clothes and single piece of luggage with obvious skepticism. That's 40 miles through the country that can kill experienced riders when conditions turn bad. In weather like this, with visibility near zero and temperatures dropping toward 20 below, attempting that journey alone would be suicide. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The brutal honesty of his assessment forced Rebecca to confront possibilities she had tried not to consider during her journey west. What if Daniel Foster had changed his mind about marriage to a woman he'd never met? What if his ranch was struggling financially in ways he hadn't disclosed in their correspondence? What if the isolation she had viewed as protection from Marcus proved to be its own form of trap? But Rebecca had learned something crucial about herself during the months of planning her escape from Baltimore. Desperate circumstances revealed capabilities she had never known she possessed. The same resourcefulness that had enabled her to forge identity documents, plan a cross-country journey, and reinvent herself as Rebecca Walsh would have to serve her now in navigating this new crisis. "Mr. Williams," Rebecca said, making a decision that surprised her with its certainty, "I understand the risks involved in traveling to Foster's ranch in current conditions. But I also understand the risks involved in remaining visible and traceable for anyone who might be looking for Rebecca Walsh. If I can't wait here safely, and I can't reach my destination directly, then I need a third option that keeps me moving while providing adequate shelter." Williams's expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching respect as he recognized the practical intelligence behind her request. "There might be such an option," he admitted slowly. "About 15 miles northeast of here, there's an abandoned mining camp called Silver Creek. Used to be a boom town during the mineral rush 5 years ago, but the mines played out and most folks moved on. Some of the buildings are still sound, and there's usually enough firewood and supplies left behind to keep someone alive for a few days." The suggestion offered exactly the kind of compromise Rebecca needed between the danger of remaining stationary and the impossibility of reaching Daniel Foster's ranch in current conditions. Silver Creek would provide temporary shelter while keeping her location uncertain for anyone attempting to track her movements. Most importantly, it would position her closer to her ultimate destination while maintaining the flexibility to adapt as circumstances changed. "Could you provide directions to this mining camp?" Rebecca asked, her decision already made despite the obvious risks involved. Williams's directions were detailed but sobering. The route to Silver Creek followed a wagon road that was well marked during good weather but became treacherous when snow obscured familiar landmarks. The abandoned camp offered basic shelter, but anyone using it would need to provide their own heat, food, and protection from elements that could prove fatal within hours if proper precautions weren't taken. "Ma'am," Williams concluded as he helped her purchase essential supplies from the station's small store, "I have to advise against this course of action. That road can be dangerous even for folks who know the country well. A woman traveling alone with city experience and minimal supplies." He left the sentence unfinished, but Rebecca understood the implications. "Mr. Williams," Rebecca replied with quiet determination, 3 months ago I was a different woman, facing different choices. The woman I am now understands that calculated risks are often preferable to guaranteed dangers." The supplies she purchased were basic but essential. Heavy wool coat, waterproof boots, dried food, matches, a small axe that Williams insisted she take for firewood cutting, and a compass that might prove crucial if visibility remained poor. The total cost consumed most of the money Daniel Foster had provided for her journey. But Rebecca understood that survival required investment in proper equipment. As she prepared to leave Cheyenne Station, Rebecca reflected on the series of desperate decisions that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been Rebecca Porter, living in comfortable deception in Baltimore, pretending not to notice her husband's criminal activities in exchange for financial security and social respectability. The discovery of Marcus's hidden enterprises had forced her to choose between complicity and escape. Escape had led to the decision to assume a false identity and seek marriage with a Western rancher. Daniel Foster's failure to appear at Cheyenne Station had created another crisis, requiring immediate adaptation. Each choice had narrowed her options while increasing the stakes, transforming her from a woman seeking safety into someone willing to risk everything on uncertain outcomes. The journey from Cheyenne Station towards Silver Creek tested every assumption Rebecca had made about her own capabilities and endurance. The wagon road that Williams had described as well-marked quickly became a barely visible track through snow that reached her knees in places. The heavy supplies she carried grew more burdensome with each mile, forcing frequent rest stops that exposed her to wind that seemed determined to freeze any exposed skin within minutes. But the physical challenges of winter travel also revealed mental resources Rebecca hadn't known she possessed. The same analytical skills that had enabled her to recognize the patterns of Marcus's abuse now helped her navigate by reading subtle changes in terrain and vegetation. The caution that had kept her alive during 3 years of dangerous marriage now guided her decisions about when to push forward and when to seek temporary shelter. Most importantly, the isolation that might have terrified the woman she had been in Baltimore felt liberating to the person she was becoming. For the first time in years, Rebecca could make decisions based solely on her own welfare and judgment, without considering how her choices might trigger someone else's violence. The sound that made her deviate from the road toward Silver Creek came as afternoon light began to fade and snow continued to fall with increasing intensity. It was a sound that didn't belong in the natural symphony of wind through bare branches and her own labored breathing. Human voices, faint but unmistakably distressed, calling through the storm from somewhere off the main trail. Rebecca's first instinct was to ignore the voices and continue toward the shelter she desperately needed to reach before darkness made travel impossible. Getting involved with other people's emergencies would delay her arrival at Silver Creek, increase her exposure to dangerous conditions, and potentially compromise the anonymity she had worked so hard to maintain. But as she stood in the deepening snow, listening to those distant cries for help, Rebecca realized that survival instincts weren't the only forces shaping her decisions. The desperation that had driven her across a continent was now demanding that she investigate voices that might indicate people facing the same life-threatening situation she was. Confronting the decision to leave the road felt like stepping into an abyss. But Rebecca Walsh, who had already, metaphorically, stepped off several cliffs during the past 6 months, adjusted her grip on her supplies and began fighting her way through snowdrifts toward voices that grew clearer with each difficult step. What she discovered would transform her understanding of her own purpose and capabilities in ways that no amount of personal survival could have accomplished. Sometimes the people we encounter, while running from our own problems, turn out to be exactly the people we're meant to help. The voices led Rebecca deeper into the Wyoming wilderness than any rational person should have ventured during a December blizzard. Each step away from the wagon road decreased her chances of survival, but the desperate cries grew stronger as she pushed through snow that reached her waist in places. The wind carried fragments of words that made her heart race with recognition of terror she knew too well. "Help us! Please help us!" The voice belonged to a child, a girl maybe 12 years old, with the kind of authority that suggested she was trying to maintain order while fighting panic. Behind that voice came others, younger and more frightened, creating a chorus of desperation that cut through the storm like knives. Rebecca abandoned all caution and began running toward the sounds, her city boots slipping on hidden ice and her carpet bag banging against her legs. The forest around her rose steeply, following what appeared to be a natural creek bed now buried under feet of accumulated snow. The children's voices seemed to originate from just ahead, always just ahead, like phantom calls in a nightmare. When she finally reached the source of the cries, What Rebecca discovered defied every assumption she had made about the situation. This wasn't a group of children lost in the storm. These were children buried alive, their small bodies trapped beneath snow that had accumulated over what must have been days. The site had once been some kind of structure, perhaps a trapper's cabin or hunting lodge that had collapsed under the weight of previous storms. Scattered logs and broken foundation stones created a natural depression that had become a snow-filled grave for 15 human beings whose only crime had been existing in the wrong place when winter struck with unusual fury. Small hands emerged from the white surface, like desperate prayers made visible. Arms waved frantically above the snowline, attached to bodies that remained invisible beneath the deadly accumulation. Most heartbreaking of all, faces appeared and disappeared as children struggled to keep their heads above drifts that threatened to bury them completely. "Dear God," Rebecca whispered, dropping her supplies and falling to her knees beside the nearest struggling child. "How many of you are there? How long have you been trapped here?" 15 of us, gasped the girl whose voice had guided Rebecca through the forest. Her name was Anna Kowalski, and despite being only 13 years old, she possessed the kind of composure that shouldn't have been necessary for someone her age. "We've been here 4 days. The snow keeps getting deeper and we're getting weaker." Rebecca's mind reeled as she tried to comprehend the magnitude of what she was witnessing. 15 children had somehow survived for 4 days in conditions that would have killed most adults within hours. The logistics of rescue seemed impossible for one person, but the alternative was watching them die one by one, as hypothermia and exhaustion claimed the weakest first. "I'm going to get every one of you out," Rebecca promised, though she had no idea how such a commitment could be fulfilled. "But I need to understand what happened here and how you've managed to survive this long." Anna's story emerged in fragments as Rebecca began the desperate work of excavating children from snow that had frozen solid around their small bodies. The 15 weren't random victims of the storm. They were runaways from something called the Riverside Children's Home, a state institution located 60 miles southeast of Cheyenne that had been their prison for months or years. It wasn't a home, Ender explained, as Rebecca used her bare hands to scrape away ice that had formed around a smaller child's shoulders. It was a work camp where they sent children nobody wanted. They made us process wool and work looms 18 hours a day. If you collapsed from exhaustion, they locked you in the root cellar until you either died or got strong enough to work again. The children's escape had been planned by Anna and 2 boys named Benjamin Torres and Christopher Adams, who had been at Riverside longer than most and understood the patterns of guard supervision and security procedures. They had waited for the first major blizzard of winter, knowing that severe weather would make immediate pursuit difficult. "We thought we could reach the railroad tracks," Anna continued, as Rebecca moved to another trapped child, this one so small he couldn't have been more than 7 years old. "Follow them to a town where someone would help us. But we got lost in the dark, and then the snow got too deep to walk through." The collapsed structure they had discovered had seemed like salvation initially. The broken timbers provided some protection from wind, and the depression created by the ruined foundation offered shelter from the worst of the storm. But as snow continued to fall over 4 days, what had been a refuge became a trap that buried them alive inch by inch. "We tried to dig out yesterday," explained Benjamin Torres, whose calm voice masked the exhaustion that was evident in his barely visible face. "But every time we clear an area, more snow fills it in. We're getting too weak to keep fighting." Rebecca surveyed the scene with growing horror, mixed with admiration for what these children had accomplished. Several of the smallest had stopped moving entirely, their bodies so deeply buried that only their faces remained above the snow line. Without immediate intervention, she was witnessing multiple deaths from exposure and hypothermia that could occur within hours. The survival strategy the children had developed revealed intelligence and cooperation that most adults never achieved. They had created a network of connected air pockets beneath the snow, sharing body heat through a system of tunnels that allowed the strongest to provide warmth to the weakest. They had rationed their meager food supplies according to need, rather than size, ensuring that the youngest received priority even as older children's strength failed. Most remarkably, Anna had organized everything with the kind of natural leadership that emerges during true emergencies. She had established buddy systems to monitor each child for signs of hypothermia. She had maintained group morale through songs and stories that kept everyone awake and alert. She had made life and death decisions about resource allocation with wisdom that would have impressed experienced military commanders. "Anna coordinated our whole escape," said Christopher Adams, the third member of their leadership team, whose organizational abilities had clearly been crucial to their 4-day survival. "She figured out the guard schedules, planned our route, and kept us all together when everything went wrong. She's the reason any of us are still alive. The systematic cruelty that had driven these children to risk death in a Wyoming blizzard filled." Rebecca, with rage that surpassed anything she had felt during her own abuse at Marcus's hands. Riverside Children's Home had been established as a solution to the problem of orphaned and abandoned children in Wyoming territory, but had apparently evolved into something closer to a forced labor operation. Children as young as 5 were required to operate dangerous machinery processing wool and textiles. Those who couldn't maintain productivity were beaten or starved until they either improved their performance or died from the treatment. Escape attempts resulted in punishment that frequently proved fatal. Through deliberate neglect in unheated confinement areas, my little sister tried to run away 6 months ago, whispered one of the younger girls as Rebecca carefully freed her from snow that had frozen around her like concrete. They caught her and put her in the punishment shed. She never came out. They said she died of pneumonia, but we knew. She couldn't finish the sentence, but Rebecca understood. The institutional abuse these children had endured made Marcus's violence seem almost personal by comparison. Marcus had terrorized one person for his own twisted satisfaction. Riverside Children's Home was terrorizing 15 defenseless children as a matter of policy, treating their suffering as an acceptable cost of maintaining order and productivity. The rescue process that followed tested Rebecca's physical and emotional limits in ways she had never imagined possible. Using her small axe to break through the hardest snow and her increasingly numb hands to excavate around small bodies, she worked methodically through the buried group while fighting her own battle against hypothermia and exhaustion. Each child presented different challenges that required constant adaptation of technique and strategy. Some had been trapped so long that their clothing had frozen to the snow around them, requiring painstaking work to free fabric without tearing away their only insulation. Others had lost feeling in their extremities and couldn't assist in their own rescue, becoming dead weight that strained Rebecca's failing strength. The smallest children were barely conscious, their bodies beginning to shut down from prolonged exposure to conditions that had already exceeded human endurance limits. Rebecca found herself making rapid medical decisions based on nothing more than intuition and desperation, prioritizing rescues based on who seemed most likely to survive the ordeal. As she worked, Rebecca began to understand the remarkable community these children had created under impossible circumstances. They shared information constantly, warning her about children who had shown signs of unconsciousness or alerting her to areas where the snow was particularly deep or unstable. They encouraged each other with words of hope and determination that seemed impossible given their desperate situation. Most importantly, they had maintained their humanity through an ordeal that would have broken most adults. The older children continued to comfort the younger ones, even as their own strength failed. They shared their remaining food and water with systematic fairness that ensured no one was forgotten or abandoned. They had created a family based on mutual support that transcended the biological relationships none of them possessed. "We stick together," Anna repeated whenever one of the children expressed fear about what would happen after rescue. All of us, no matter what. We've come too far to break apart now. By the time Rebecca had excavated all 15 children from their snow graves, complete darkness had fallen, and the storm had intensified to the point where travel was impossible. The rescued children huddled together in the slight shelter provided by the collapsed cabin ruins, but their situation remained desperate. Several showed signs of advanced hypothermia that could prove fatal within hours. All were soaked through with melted snow and had no dry clothing for protection against temperatures that continued to drop. Most critically, Rebecca realized that reaching Silver Creek mining camp with 15 weakened children through a blizzard was impossible. Even if she could locate the abandoned settlement in current conditions, moving the group through deep snow in darkness would likely result in deaths that rescue had been intended to prevent. "We need immediate shelter," Rebecca announced, surveying their available resources with the kind of practical analysis that had enabled her survival in Baltimore. "Real protection from this wind, and we need it here because none of us are going anywhere tonight." The solution that emerged combined Rebecca's desperate creativity with the children's hard-won survival knowledge. Using salvageable timbers from the collapsed cabin and her axe to cut additional materials, they began constructing what amounted to a reinforced snow cave that could accommodate all 16 people. The technique involved digging into the accumulated snowdrifts to create a hollow space, then lining that space with broken boards to prevent collapse. The children's small size became an advantage, allowing them to work in cramped conditions that would have been impossible for adults to navigate. Anna and the older children had learned emergency shelter construction during previous escape attempts, their knowledge filling crucial gaps in Rebecca's understanding of insulation principles, air circulation and fire safety in enclosed spaces. Their combined expertise created something that resembled actual survival architecture rather than improvised desperation. "The secret is making it just big enough," Anna explained as they arranged salvaged lumber into a framework that would support the weight of snow above them. "Too big and we can't keep it warm." "Too small and we don't have room to move around and maintain circulation." The construction process took hours of exhausting work in conditions that grew more dangerous each minute. Rebecca's hands had lost all feeling, and several of the children were showing signs of confusion that indicated hypothermia was advancing toward life-threatening stages. But gradually, their desperate collaboration began to create something that resembled genuine shelter. The finished structure was cave-like but reinforced, large enough for all 16 survivors, but small enough to be heated by their combined body heat. Pine boughs that the older children had gathered provided insulation from the frozen ground. Most importantly, a small fire pit constructed from foundation. Stones offered the possibility of warmth that could mean the difference between survival and death. The first fire Rebecca managed to build inside their improvised shelter represented more than heat. It represented hope that they could survive the night and beyond that. Hope that she could figure out what to do with 15 children who couldn't return to the institution. They had risked everything to escape. As the children pressed close to the tiny flame, steam rising from their wet clothes and color slowly returning to blue-tinged faces, Rebecca studied each face in the flickering light. 15 individual children ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 14, each with their own story of abandonment or tragedy that had led them to Riverside Children's Home. Anna Kowalski, the natural leader whose determination had kept everyone alive. Benjamin Torres and Christopher Adams, whose planning abilities had made escape possible. Twin sisters named Helen and Rose Martinez, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Brothers named Jack and Tom Sullivan, whose identical freckled faces showed identical expressions of cautious hope. Rebecca realized with growing certainty that these children had become her responsibility in ways that extended far beyond the immediate emergency. They couldn't return to Riverside, where their escape attempt would result in punishment that could easily prove fatal. They had no families to claim them, no resources to support independent survival, no legal advocates to protect their interests. But they also possessed something extraordinary that transcended their desperate circumstances. Under Anna's leadership, they had created a functioning community based on principles of mutual aid and shared responsibility that most adult organizations never achieved. Their survival through 4 days of burial had required cooperation and selflessness that revealed character depths that institutional abuse had been unable to destroy. As the storm continued to rage outside their shelter, and their small fire struggled against drafts that threatened to extinguish their only source of warmth. Rebecca faced the question that had been growing more urgent with each rescued child. What happened next? 15 children were depending on her to provide answers she didn't possess, solutions to problems that seemed to have no good options. They couldn't remain in the wilderness indefinitely. They couldn't return to the institution that had driven them to risk death for freedom. They had no legal status that would protect them from authorities who would inevitably search for escaped state wards. But as Rebecca looked around at faces illuminated by firelight, children who had created family relationships based on choice rather than biology, who had developed survival skills through necessity that surpassed her own wilderness knowledge, she began to understand that the rescue was only the beginning of a much larger challenge. These children had taught her something crucial about strength and survival that her own experience with Marcus had only begun to reveal. Real courage wasn't just escaping from danger. It was taking responsibility for protecting others who couldn't protect themselves. The woman who had fled Baltimore, seeking only personal safety, was discovering that her greatest purpose might involve ensuring that 15 remarkable children had the chance to become the extraordinary adults their survival skills suggested they could be. Dawn would bring new decisions and greater challenges. But tonight, for the first time since leaving Riverside Children's Home, 15 children were warm, safe, and protected by someone who understood that their welfare was more important than her own comfort or security. Rebecca Walsh was beginning to understand that running away from her problems had led her directly to the people she was meant to save. Dawn revealed a world transformed by the night storm. Snow had piled against their makeshift shelter until only the smoke hole remained visible from outside, creating insulation that had probably saved all their lives. But as Rebecca carefully fed twigs to their dying fire and watched 15 children slowly wake from exhausted sleep, she faced the reality that survival through one night was merely the first challenge in an increasingly complex situation. Rose Martinez, one of the younger twin sisters, had developed a fever during the night that left her barely able to sit upright. Her sister Helen refused to leave Rose's side, which meant their entire group's movement would be limited by the pace of 2 struggling children. Several of the older boys showed signs of frostbite on their fingers and toes, damage that could worsen quickly if they were exposed to cold conditions during travel. "Miss Rebecca," Anna said, using the respectful address the children had adopted without discussion, "we can't stay here much longer." The snow stopped, but that means they might start searching for us again. Riverside sends trackers after runaways, and they know these mountains better than we do. The threat of pursuit added urgency to decisions that were already complicated by limited options and dangerous conditions. Rebecca's original plan to reach Silver Creek mining camp had assumed she would be traveling alone with adequate supplies. Moving 15 weakened children through mountain terrain while evading professional trackers required resources and knowledge she didn't possess. But Rebecca had learned something crucial about leadership. During her years of surviving Marcus's unpredictable violence, effective decision-making under pressure required gathering information, assessing available options, and choosing the best alternative even when all choices involved significant risks. "How far is Daniel Foster's ranch from here?" Rebecca asked, consulting the directions that had brought her to Wyoming territory. "Could we reach it if we traveled carefully and took rest breaks for the younger children?" Benjamin Torres, whose practical mind had contributed to their escape planning, studied the hand-drawn map that Daniel Foster had provided. "It's maybe 25 miles northeast, through a country I've never seen before. In good weather, with everyone healthy, we might make it in 2 days. With Rose sick and some of us dealing with frostbite injuries." He didn't finish the assessment, but Rebecca understood the implications. Their group couldn't maintain the pace necessary to outrun professional pursuit while accommodating children who were already operating at the limits of their physical capabilities. The solution that emerged came from Christopher Adams, whose organizational abilities had proven crucial to their survival. "What if we don't try to outrun the trackers? What if we make ourselves harder to find instead?" His proposal involved splitting their movement into smaller groups that could travel different routes toward the same destination, making it more difficult for trackers to follow a single large trail through the snow. The strategy had merit, but it also meant separating children who had survived through mutual support, potentially leaving the weakest members without adequate protection. "No," Anna said firmly, echoing the principle that had guided all their decisions since leaving Riverside. "We stay together, all of us. If some of us get caught because we're moving slowly, at least we get caught together. If we split up and something happens to one group, the rest of us might never know what became of them." The moral wisdom of Anna's position was undeniable, but it left them with the challenge of moving 15 people through mountain wilderness while avoiding detection by trackers who possessed superior knowledge of local terrain and weather conditions. Rebecca's decision to attempt reaching Daniel Foster's ranch represented a calculated risk that could either provide the sanctuary they desperately needed or deliver them directly into a situation where her mail-order marriage arrangement became complicated by the presence of 15 fugitive children. The journey that began as they emerged from their shelter tested every assumption Rebecca had made about the children's capabilities and her own leadership skills. What should have been a straightforward trek through a familiar country became an exercise in crisis management, as terrain, weather, and individual medical needs created obstacles that demanded constant adaptation. The first crisis came within hours of beginning their travel. Jack Sullivan, one of the twin brothers, stepped through snow that concealed a hidden creek, soaking his feet and lower legs in water that began freezing to his skin within minutes. Without immediate intervention, frostbite damage could progress to the point where amputation became necessary to prevent life-threatening infection. The treatment required stopping their entire group while Rebecca and the older children worked to rewarm Jack's feet using body heat and friction massage. The process took nearly an hour, during which they remained stationary and visible to any trackers who might be following their trail through the snow. "We can make a travois," suggested Tom Sullivan, whose concern for his twin brother was evident in his willingness to shoulder additional burdens. "Carry him between 2 people so he doesn't have to walk on damaged feet." The improvised stretcher they constructed from pine branches and Rebecca's spare clothing worked effectively, but required 4 children to take turns pulling, while others broke trail through snow that remained knee-deep even on established paths. The physical demands pushed everyone beyond their existing limits while reducing their travel speed to a pace that made reaching Daniel Foster's ranch before nightfall impossible. But the crisis also revealed something remarkable about the children's collective problem-solving abilities. Without adult direction, they had organized themselves into an efficient support system where everyone contributed according to their capabilities. The strongest took turns pulling the travois. Others shared the burden of carrying essential supplies. Anna and the older children ranged ahead to scout the trail, while Christopher brought up the rear to ensure no one fell behind. Most impressively, they had established communication systems that kept everyone informed about obstacles. rest needs and changing conditions, without creating the kind of noise that might alert distant trackers to their location. Rebecca found herself learning from their organizational methods rather than directing their efforts. These children had developed survival skills through necessity that surpassed her own improvised wilderness knowledge. Their experience escaping institutional control and surviving extreme conditions had taught them cooperation techniques that many adult groups never achieved. The second crisis revealed the complexity of their legal situation. Late in the afternoon, they encountered another traveler on the trail, a territorial mail carrier named William Hayes, who was traveling between remote settlements with official correspondence. Hayes was an experienced frontiersman whose keen observation immediately recognized the unusual nature of their group. "That's quite a family you've got there, ma'am," Hayes commented, his professional curiosity clearly aroused by the sight of one woman traveling with 15 children through mountain wilderness during winter conditions. Heading somewhere special in this weather, Rebecca felt her pulse accelerate as she realized this encounter could determine whether their journey continued or ended with all 16 of them in territorial custody. Hayes carried official mail, which meant he probably had connections to law enforcement agencies that might already be searching for escaped children from Riverside. Her response needed to satisfy Hayes's curiosity without providing information that could lead to their immediate capture. The story she improvised drew on elements of truth while concealing the most dangerous aspects of their actual situation. "We're traveling to my husband's ranch after a family emergency back east," Rebecca replied, hoping her voice carried more confidence than she felt. "These children lost their parents in a typhoid outbreak, and we're taking them to live with relatives who can provide proper care." The explanation was plausible enough to account for their circumstances without inviting detailed investigation. More importantly, it positioned Rebecca as a responsible adult addressing a legitimate family crisis rather than someone harboring fugitives from state institutions. Anna stepped forward with the kind of composed dignity that continued to amaze Rebecca. "Our parents died 3 months ago," Anna said, meeting Hayes's gaze directly. "Miss Rebecca and her husband are the only family we have left." The supporting testimony from other children reinforced their fabricated story with details that made their account more believable. Benjamin mentioned the long train journey from back east, where the typhoid outbreak had occurred. Rose, despite her fever, managed to speak coherently about being grateful for Rebecca's willingness to help them during such difficult circumstances. Hayes's questions continued for several minutes, but the children's consistent and believable responses gradually satisfied his professional curiosity. Their obvious respect for Rebecca and clear evidence of adequate care under challenging conditions supported the narrative of a responsible family managing a tragic situation. "Typhoid's terrible business," Hayes said finally, his official suspicion giving way to human sympathy. "You folks are lucky to have someone willing to take on such responsibility during hard times." After Hayes departed, continuing toward Cheyenne with mail that might or might not include reports about missing children from territorial institutions, Rebecca realized how narrowly they had avoided disaster. But she also understood something important about the children's capabilities under pressure that extended beyond their survival skills. "Where did that story come from?" Rebecca asked Anna as they resumed their journey toward Daniel Foster's ranch. "It's close enough to true that we could remember the details," Anna replied with pragmatic wisdom that shouldn't have existed in someone her age. "And it explains why we're all together without making anyone suspicious about why one adult would be responsible for so many children who aren't related." The strategic thinking behind their deception impressed Rebecca almost as much as their ability to execute it convincingly under pressure. These children had learned to navigate dangerous adult authority through careful truth-telling that revealed nothing compromising while satisfying official curiosity. By the time they reached the boundaries of Daniel Foster's Bighorn Valley Ranch, exhaustion had pushed everyone to their physical limits. Rose Martinez's fever had worsened despite their efforts to keep her warm and hydrated. Several children showed signs of hypothermia that could become serious if they didn't reach adequate shelter soon. Most critically, they had consumed the last of their food supplies, leaving them dependent on Daniel Foster's generosity for basic survival. The ranch complex that appeared through the evening light exceeded Rebecca's expectations based on Daniel's modest correspondence. 3 substantial log buildings dominated a natural meadow surrounded by protective ridges that would shelter livestock and provide security from winter storms. Smoke rose from the main house's chimney, and cattle moved across distant pastures like dark shapes against the snow. "It's beautiful," whispered Helen Martinez, whose twin sister Rose was now too weak to walk without assistance. "It looks like the kind of place where people could be safe and happy." Rebecca hoped Helen's assessment proved accurate, because their entire future depended on the character and generosity of a man she had never met face to face. Daniel Foster emerged from his ranch house as their exhausted group approached his front gate. At 41, he matched the physical description from his letters: tall, lean, with graying hair, and the kind of steady presence that came from years of managing complex operations under challenging conditions. His expression as he observed 16 travelers instead of the single mail-order bride he had been expecting progressed through surprise, concern, and finally a kind of thoughtful curiosity that suggested he was accustomed to unexpected developments. "Rebecca Walsh, I presume," Daniel said, his tone carrying careful formality as he studied the group of children who surrounded her. "Though I confess your traveling companions weren't mentioned in any of our correspondence." The moment of truth had arrived. Rebecca could attempt to maintain the deceptions that had brought her to Wyoming, creating elaborate explanations about unexpected family obligations and temporary circumstances. Or she could trust that Daniel Foster's character matched what she had inferred from his letters and risk everything on complete honesty about their desperate situation. "Mr. Foster," Rebecca began, her voice steadying as she committed to truth over safety. "My name isn't Rebecca Walsh, and these children aren't my relatives. But we're all in desperate need of help, and I'm hoping you're the kind of man who might be willing to listen to our story before making decisions about what to do with us." Daniel's reaction surprised her. Instead of anger at the deception or suspicion about her motives, his expression showed what appeared to be relief, mixed with genuine interest. "I wondered what kind of woman would agree to marry a stranger and move to one of the most isolated ranches in Wyoming territory," he said with unexpected humor. "The real story is probably more interesting than anything I imagined during our correspondence." Over the next hour, as they gathered around Daniel's kitchen table while Rose Martinez recovered in a warm bed and the other children explored what might become their new home, Rebecca told Daniel Foster everything. Her real identity as Rebecca Porter, fleeing an abusive criminal husband in Baltimore, the children's escape from institutional abuse at Riverside, the blizzard rescue that had made her responsible for 15 lives, the impossible legal and practical challenges they faced as fugitives seeking sanctuary. Daniel listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as the scope of their situation became clear. When Rebecca finished, he remained quiet for several minutes, studying the faces of children who waited to learn whether they had found sanctuary or simply encountered another adult who would ultimately betray their trust. 15 children, Daniel said finally. "All of them runaways from state custody, and you, a woman fleeing a violent husband who probably has resources to track you down eventually." He shook his head slowly, and Rebecca felt her hopes sink as she anticipated rejection disguised as reasonable self-protection. But Daniel's next words surprised her completely. "I came to Wyoming territory 15 years ago because I needed space to build something meaningful away from the kind of people who use violence to control others. This ranch has more land, more resources, and more isolation than one man needs. The question is whether you children are prepared for the kind of work it takes to make a frontier operation successful. Anna's response was immediate and confident. We know how to work, Mr. Foster. We know how to work together. And we understand the difference between fair labor and exploitation. Then let's discuss what kind of arrangement might benefit everyone involved, Daniel replied. Because running a ranch this size requires more help than I can hire. And raising children requires more community than any isolated adult can provide alone. The negotiation that followed revealed Daniel Foster to be a man whose practical wisdom matched his generous instincts, but also someone who understood that charity without purpose often failed to provide lasting security. Rather than offering simple sanctuary, he proposed a partnership that would address everyone's needs while creating sustainable solutions to their complex challenges. The children could remain at the ranch as his legal wards, protected by his territorial citizenship and property rights. Rebecca could formalize their marriage arrangement, providing her with legal protection from Marcus while giving Daniel the domestic partnership he had originally sought. Most importantly, the ranch's isolation offered exactly the kind of sanctuary where 15 remarkable children could develop their capabilities while remaining safely hidden from institutional authorities. As the evening progressed and specific arrangements took shape, Rebecca realized that her journey from Baltimore to Wyoming had brought her to exactly where she needed to be, though not for reasons she could have anticipated when she first boarded the train as a desperate refugee. She had found her purpose not in escaping her own problems, but in helping others overcome challenges that were far more serious than anything she had faced. The children who had taught her about survival were about to teach her about building something lasting and meaningful from the fragments of broken lives. Daniel Foster's ranch would become more than a sanctuary. It would become the foundation for a community where former victims could transform their survival skills into tools for creating security and opportunity for others who needed protection from a world that often treated the vulnerable as disposable. Resources. The first month at Bighorn Valley Ranch revealed that good intentions required more than generosity to transform into sustainable solutions. Daniel Foster's willingness to provide sanctuary had solved their immediate crisis. But integrating 16 people into a working ranch operation created challenges none of them had anticipated during their initial negotiations. The ranch's financial situation was more precarious than Daniel had initially disclosed. 3 consecutive years of harsh winters had decimated his cattle herds, while falling beef prices made it difficult to recover losses through normal market operations. The account books Rebecca discovered while helping organize Daniel's business records told a sobering story of mounting debts, delayed payments to suppliers, and creditors who were growing impatient with promises of future prosperity. I should have been more forthright about the ranch's financial condition, Daniel admitted during a private conversation 3 weeks after their arrival. Taking on responsibility for 17 people when I can barely maintain operations for 1 wasn't practical planning. It was wishful thinking disguised as charity. The revelation forced Rebecca to confront uncomfortable similarities between her current situation and the circumstances she had fled in Baltimore. Once again, she found herself dependent on a man whose resources were insufficient to guarantee long-term security. The difference was that Daniel's struggles stemmed from honest efforts to build something meaningful rather than Marcus's criminal activities. But financial vulnerability remained dangerous regardless of its causes. But Rebecca had learned something crucial about leadership during her months of protecting the children. Problems that seemed insurmountable when viewed as burdens often became opportunities when approached as challenges that required creative solutions. Instead of seeing 15 children as additional mouths to feed, what if they could become contributors to economic recovery rather than obstacles to financial stability? The plan Rebecca developed during long winter evenings drew on everything she had observed about the children's capabilities and organizational skills. Rather than treating them as dependents who required support, she proposed integrating them as partners in a diversified operation that could generate income through multiple revenue streams while providing practical education that would serve them throughout their lives. Anna and the older children could manage expanded agricultural operations that would reduce the ranch's dependence on cattle while creating products for sale to mining camps and settlements throughout the territory. Benjamin and Christopher could coordinate systematic improvements to ranch infrastructure that would increase operational efficiency while developing valuable construction skills. Even the younger children could contribute through activities like egg collection, butter churning, and textile production that generated modest but consistent income. Most importantly, the children's demonstrated abilities in cooperation and resource management could be applied to streamline ranch operations in ways that reduced costs while improving productivity. Their experience surviving together had taught them conservation techniques and efficiency methods that could benefit the entire enterprise. Daniel's response to Rebecca's proposal revealed both his practical intelligence and his growing understanding of what these remarkable children could accomplish when given meaningful responsibilities. You're suggesting we transform this ranch into something like a cooperative where everyone contributes according to their abilities and shares in whatever prosperity we can create. Together, I'm suggesting we recognize what these children actually are, Rebecca replied. They're not helpless refugees waiting for adults to solve their problems. They're capable individuals who have already proven they can work together to achieve remarkable things under impossible conditions. The implementation of their expanded ranch operations began with comprehensive assessment of available resources and untapped opportunities. Working systematically through every aspect of the property, Rebecca and the children identified possibilities that Daniel had never considered during his years of focus on cattle ranching. Creekside land that had been dismissed as unsuitable for grazing could support intensive vegetable cultivation using irrigation techniques that Benjamin had learned during his years at Riverside. Outbuildings that had served only as storage could be converted into workshops for producing furniture, tools, and textiles that commanded premium prices in territorial markets where quality craftsmanship was scarce. Most significantly, the children's diverse backgrounds provided skills that complemented ranch operations in unexpected ways. Several had developed expertise in mechanical repair while maintaining institutional equipment. Others possessed knowledge of food preservation, leatherworking, and metal fabrication that could either reduce expenses for outside services or create products for commercial sale. The transformation of Bighorn Valley Ranch from struggling cattle operation to diversified enterprise required months of intensive work that tested everyone's commitment to their collective success. The children's vegetable gardens produced surplus crops that sold quickly in Cheyenne and surrounding mining communities. Their workshop operations created furniture and equipment that generated steady income while building reputations for reliable quality. But the most significant change was in the ranch's social atmosphere. What had been Daniel's isolated bachelor operation became a thriving community where 17 individuals contributed according to their capabilities while sharing the benefits of their collective efforts. The first serious test of their new arrangements came when Rose Martinez, who had recovered from the fever that nearly killed her during their journey to the ranch, was injured while helping with livestock management. The accident occurred when Rose attempted to move a gate that was heavier than she had anticipated, resulting in a broken wrist and concerns about whether children should be involved in potentially dangerous ranch work. Rebecca's response to the crisis demonstrated how completely her priorities had evolved since arriving in Wyoming. Rather than viewing Rose's injury as evidence that children shouldn't participate in ranch operations, She organized comprehensive safety improvements that addressed potential hazards throughout their expanded enterprise. Working with Anna and the older children, Rebecca developed safety protocols that were more thorough than those typically implemented in adult-only operations. Every work assignment was evaluated for age-appropriate participation. Safety equipment was purchased or improvised to protect workers who were smaller and less experienced than typical ranch hands. Most importantly, the accident became an opportunity to reinforce community principles that everyone's welfare was everyone's responsibility. While Rose recovered from her injuries, with her arm properly splintered and immobilized, other children absorbed her usual responsibilities without complaint. When she was able to return to work, modified assignments kept her productive while protecting her healing wrist from activities that might cause re-injury. The incident strengthened Rebecca's relationship with Daniel by demonstrating her commitment to protecting the children while maintaining their valuable contributions to ranch success. Daniel had been prepared for Rebecca to withdraw the children from potentially dangerous work after Rose's accident. Instead, she had organized improvements that made everyone safer while preserving the economic benefits of their participation. You've given more thought to these children's safety and development than most parents provide for their own families, Daniel observed while reviewing the new safety procedures. They're fortunate to have someone who takes their welfare so seriously while still treating them as capable individuals. The comment touched something deep in Rebecca's understanding of her own transformation. 6 months earlier, she had been focused entirely on personal survival, fleeing Marcus with no consideration for anyone else's welfare. Now she found herself making decisions based on the needs of 16 other people, accepting responsibility for their safety, education, and future prospects. The change felt both dramatic and natural, as if protecting these children had awakened capabilities she had always possessed, but never had reason to develop. Perhaps the capacity to nurture and guide wasn't limited to biological relationships. Perhaps leadership skills emerged from proximity to need, rather than formal training or inherited authority. Spring's arrival brought new challenges that tested the community bonds they had been developing through winter months of close cooperation. The warming weather that made travel possible also increased the risk that authorities from Riverside Children's Home might resume searching for their escaped residents. More concerning, Daniel received inquiries from territorial officials who had heard reports of unusually large numbers of children residing at Bighorn Valley Ranch. While the questions were presented as routine administrative matters, they suggested that someone was taking official interest in their unconventional household arrangements. The solution Rebecca developed drew on legal knowledge she had acquired during her marriage to Marcus, when understanding business law had been necessary for managing household finances while her husband pursued criminal enterprises. Rather than attempting to hide the children's presence or maintain deceptions about their backgrounds, she proposed pursuing legal guardianship that would provide permanent protection under territorial law. We petitioned for formal recognition of Daniel's right to serve as guardian for all 15 children, Rebecca explained during their strategy session. If we can demonstrate that they're receiving appropriate care, education, and preparation for productive adult lives, then territorial authorities have incentives to approve arrangements that reduce their administrative burdens while improving outcomes for the children. The legal strategy was ambitious and risky. Success would require proving that Bighorn Valley Ranch provided superior care compared to institutional alternatives. Failure could result in immediate removal of all 15 children and possible criminal prosecution for harboring escaped state wards. But Rebecca's proposal had one crucial advantage. It aligned with territorial interests in reducing the costs and complications of institutional childcare. If their ranch could demonstrate that private guardianship produced better outcomes at lower public expense, officials might prefer legal recognition to expensive enforcement actions. The documentation process that preceded their formal petition became the most intensive period of organization any of them had experienced. Every aspect of ranch operations was recorded, evaluated, and prepared for official scrutiny. Rebecca created detailed reports showing each child's educational progress, work contributions, and personal development since arriving at Bighorn Valley. The children themselves became active participants in preparing for legal proceedings, understanding that their future depended on convincing territorial authorities that they were thriving under current arrangements. Their response revealed capabilities that impressed even Rebecca, who had learned to expect remarkable things from these remarkable individuals. Anna organized presentations that highlighted each child's specific achievements and contributions to ranch success. Benjamin and Christopher prepared detailed reports on agricultural and infrastructure improvements that demonstrated economic value generated through their work. Even the youngest children practiced explaining their daily routines and educational activities in ways that would satisfy official requirements. The legal hearing that would determine their permanent status was scheduled for late May, creating weeks of uncertainty during which their future remained undetermined. Rebecca used this period to cultivate relationships with community members whose testimonials could influence territorial decisions. The response from neighboring ranchers surprised Rebecca with its warmth and practical support. Families who had initially been skeptical about Daniel's unusual household arrangements had observed the children's contributions to community life and were prepared to advocate on their behalf. Those children work harder and more cooperatively than most adult crews I've supervised, testified Robert McKenzie, whose property bordered Bighorn Valley to the west. Whatever arrangement Daniel and Rebecca have created is producing capable young people who contribute positively to this entire region. Similar endorsements came from other community members who had witnessed the children's development. The territorial physician praised their improved health and nutrition compared to institutional standards. The pastor of Cheyenne's Methodist Church spoke highly of their respectful behavior during Sunday services. The merchants who purchased their agricultural products provided testimony about the quality and reliability of their work. Most importantly, Dr. Margaret Stevens, the territorial physician responsible for child welfare assessments, prepared a comprehensive report documenting remarkable improvements in physical health, emotional stability, and social development since the children's arrival at Bighorn Valley Ranch. The official inspection preceding their legal hearing was conducted by Territorial Child Welfare Inspector James Morrison, whose 25 years of experience evaluating child placement situations had left him deeply skeptical about unconventional arrangements. Morrison arrived expecting to find evidence of exploitation, inadequate supervision, or inappropriate conditions that would justify removing the children from Daniel's custody. What he discovered instead challenged every assumption he had developed about institutional versus private care. The children demonstrated educational achievements that exceeded territorial standards for their age groups. Their work contributions generated measurable economic value while providing practical training that would serve them throughout their lives. Most importantly, they had maintained healthy relationships with each other while developing individual capabilities and interests. In 25 years of child welfare work, Morrison admitted during his final interview with Rebecca and Daniel, "I've never encountered a situation where formally institutionalized children have achieved this level of development and integration. These children aren't just adequately cared for, they're thriving in ways that most state wards never experience." Morrison's official report filed with Territorial Child Welfare Services 2 weeks after his inspection recommended permanent legal guardianship for Daniel Foster over all 15 children. His documentation emphasized their educational progress, economic contributions, community integration, and psychological development as evidence that Bighorn Valley Ranch provided superior outcomes compared to institutional alternatives. The territorial response to Morrison's recommendation revealed political complexities that Rebecca hadn't fully anticipated. While officials acknowledged the superior care provided at the ranch, they faced pressure from institutional administrators who viewed the children's successful placement as implicit criticism of their own operations. Dr. Henry Bradford, director of Riverside Children's Home, lobbied aggressively against allowing the runaways to benefit from their illegal escape attempt. Bradford argued that permitting children to improve their circumstances through unauthorized departure would encourage similar actions by other institutional residents. These children are state property assigned to Riverside through proper legal procedures, Bradford argued in his formal response to Morrison's report. Allowing them to remain in unauthorized placement based on their own criminal actions establishes dangerous precedents that undermine institutional authority throughout the territory. The territorial hearing that would decide the children's permanent status became a confrontation between two fundamentally different philosophies of child welfare. Bradford and his institutional allies argued for maintaining legal authority and preventing children from benefiting through unauthorized escape. Rebecca and her supporters argued for prioritizing actual child welfare over administrative convenience. The children themselves were permitted to testify about their experiences and preferences, creating powerful contrasts between their descriptions of life at Riverside versus their current circumstances at Bighorn Valley Ranch. Anna's composed testimony about industrial exploitation versus educational opportunity impressed territorial officials with its clarity and maturity. We understand the difference between work that builds capabilities and work that destroys people, Anna said during her testimony. At Riverside, we were treated as machinery that existed to produce profit for adults who didn't care whether we lived or died. Here, we're treated as people who are learning to build something meaningful with our lives. The decision, announced 5 days after the hearing concluded, represented complete victory for Rebecca's legal strategy. Territorial Child Welfare Services granted permanent guardianship to Daniel Foster for all 15 children, officially recognizing Bighorn Valley Ranch as their legal residence and permanent family home. But the victory also revealed new responsibilities that extended beyond their immediate community. The success of their unconventional arrangement had attracted attention from other territories dealing with similar child welfare challenges, leading to requests for consultation and advice about replicating their model in other locations. Rebecca found herself corresponding with officials, social reformers, and private citizens who wanted to understand how private guardianship could produce better outcomes than institutional care. Her responses emphasized the importance of treating children as capable individuals rather than helpless dependents, providing meaningful work that developed skills rather than exploiting their labor, and creating community relationships based on mutual support rather than hierarchical control. As summer approached and their first full year together neared completion, Rebecca realized that Bighorn Valley Ranch had become something none of them had anticipated when they first sought shelter there. It wasn't simply a place where children lived safely under adult protection. It had evolved into a model for child welfare that demonstrated alternatives to institutional solutions while proving that former victims could become productive contributors when given appropriate opportunities. The transformation went deeper than policy implications or social reform potential. Rebecca looked around the dinner table each evening at faces that had changed from desperate exhaustion to confident competence. These children were developing into remarkable young adults whose capabilities and character would enable them to succeed in any circumstances they might encounter. Most importantly, they had preserved the community bonds that had kept them alive during their escape, while adapting those relationships to prosperity rather than survival. The mutual support that had once meant sharing body heat in snow caves now meant sharing knowledge, resources, and responsibilities in building something lasting and valuable that would benefit future generations of vulnerable children who needed advocates and opportunities. The letter arrived on a scorching August morning, delivered by a territorial courier whose nervous demeanor suggested he understood the gravity of what he carried. Rebecca recognized the official seal of the Baltimore Police Department before she opened the envelope, and her hands trembled as she unfolded documents that threatened to destroy everything they had built during 18 months of careful construction. Marcus Porter had been arrested 3 weeks earlier during a federal raid on his shipping operations, but not before providing detailed information about his missing wife's whereabouts to authorities, who were now requesting her return to Maryland for testimony in criminal proceedings that could determine whether he spent the rest of his life in prison. The notification letter was accompanied by a warrant requiring Rebecca's appearance in Baltimore within 60 days, along with documentation that revealed Marcus's criminal network had been far more extensive than she had understood during their marriage. Federal investigators had uncovered evidence of human trafficking operations that used forced marriage arrangements to control immigrant women, making Rebecca's testimony crucial to prosecuting crimes that had destroyed dozens of lives. Mrs. Foster, the territorial marshal who had delivered the documents, addressed Rebecca using her legal married name. "I understand this creates complications for your current circumstances, but federal law supersedes territorial arrangements. You'll need to make arrangements for travel to Baltimore regardless of personal preferences. The prospect of returning to the city where Marcus could still exercise influence through criminal associates filled Rebecca with terror that transported her back to the helpless woman she had been before discovering her strength through protecting others. But the deeper threat involved potential consequences for the children if federal authorities investigated her background thoroughly enough to discover the circumstances that had brought them together. Daniel's response to the crisis revealed the depth of character that had made him willing to accept responsibility for 16 refugees in the first place, rather than viewing Rebecca's legal troubles as complications that endangered his own security. He immediately began planning ways to protect both her interests and the children's welfare. "We face this together," Daniel said during their emergency planning session. "If you have to testify against Marcus Porter, then we make sure you have support throughout the process. If federal authorities want to investigate our household arrangements, then we demonstrate that we have nothing to hide about how these children are being cared for." But Anna had developed insights about adult authority that proved more perceptive than either Rebecca or Daniel had anticipated. During a private conversation, while the younger children were occupied with evening chores, Anna revealed concerns that extended beyond immediate legal challenges. "Miss Rebecca," Anna said, using the respectful address she had maintained despite all changes in their circumstances, "we know you came to Wyoming running from something dangerous, but sometimes running away doesn't solve problems if the person chasing you won't give up pursuit." The observation was profound enough to reshape Rebecca's understanding of her situation. For 18 months, she had focused on building new life, while hoping that Marcus would eventually abandon his efforts to locate her. But Anna was right that some threats required confrontation rather than continued evasion. "What are you suggesting?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected Anna's answer would challenge her assumptions about safety and risk. "I'm suggesting," Anna replied, with the determination that had kept 15 children alive under impossible circumstances, "that maybe it's time to stop running from Marcus Porter and start making sure he can't hurt anyone else the way he hurt you and those other women." The idea was both terrifying and liberating. Rebecca had spent almost 2 years defining herself as Marcus's victim, someone whose primary goal was avoiding his violence rather than preventing it. But Anna's suggestion offered the possibility of transformation from victim to advocate for others who remained trapped in circumstances she had escaped. The decision to return to Baltimore voluntarily, rather than as a reluctant witness compelled by federal warrants, represented the most frightening choice Rebecca had made since fleeing Maryland, but it also aligned with everything she had learned about leadership and responsibility during her months of protecting 15 children. If her testimony could prevent other women from experiencing the abuse she had endured, then personal safety became less important than public service. If confronting Marcus in court could ensure he never again threatened anyone's welfare, then courage became more valuable than security. The preparation for her return to Baltimore required weeks of careful planning that involved not just legal strategy but arrangements for the children's continued care during her absence. Rebecca had become so central to Bighorn Valley Ranch operations that her departure, even temporarily, would disrupt systems that had evolved around her organizational capabilities and decision-making authority. Anna stepped forward with a proposal that demonstrated how completely the children had internalized principles of collective responsibility and shared leadership. Rather than depending entirely on Daniel to manage their operations while Rebecca was away, she suggested that the children themselves assume greater authority over the activities they had been coordinating under adult supervision. "We know how to run the agricultural operations, manage the workshops, and maintain safety protocols," Anna explained during a community meeting where all major decisions were discussed. "Miss Rebecca taught us these systems, but we've been implementing them ourselves for months. We can continue that work while she's helping other people who need protection," Benjamin and Christopher supported Anna's proposal by outlining specific responsibilities they were prepared to assume during Rebecca's absence. The vegetable gardens that had become crucial to ranch income would be managed entirely by the older children. Workshop productions would continue under their supervision. Most importantly, the community decision-making processes that had evolved over 18 months would ensure that problems were addressed collectively rather than depending on single-person authority. Daniel's willingness to support the children's increased autonomy revealed his growing understanding of their capabilities and his confidence in the community structures they had developed together. Rather than viewing Rebecca's departure as evidence that he needed to exercise more direct control over ranch operations, he recognized it as an opportunity to demonstrate how successfully their cooperative model functioned even under stress. The journey from Wyoming to Baltimore took 5 days by train, providing Rebecca with time to prepare mentally for confronting the man whose violence had driven her across a continent. But the woman who arrived in Maryland bore little resemblance to the terrified refugee who had fled 18 months earlier. Rebecca Foster had developed confidence through months of making life-and-death decisions for people who depended on her judgment. She had learned leadership skills through necessity that enabled her to coordinate complex operations involving multiple individuals with diverse capabilities. Most importantly, she had discovered inner strength through protecting others that proved more durable than any courage she might have summoned for purely personal purposes. The Baltimore that greeted her return had changed in ways that reflected the broader social transformations occurring throughout American cities during the late 19th century. New immigrant populations had altered neighborhood demographics. Industrial expansion had created employment opportunities that attracted families seeking better economic prospects. Most significantly for Rebecca's purposes, social reform movements had gained political influence that supported efforts to address problems like domestic violence and human trafficking. The federal prosecutor assigned to Marcus Porter's case was Margaret Chen, a pioneering woman attorney whose own experiences with discrimination had sensitized her to the particular challenges faced by female witnesses in cases involving domestic abuse. Chen's initial interview with Rebecca revealed both the strength of their case against Marcus and the personal courage required to testify about experiences that most victims preferred to forget. Mrs. Foster, Chen explained during their first meeting, your husband's criminal organization operated on a scale that exceeded anything we've previously documented in Baltimore. His use of forced marriage arrangements to control immigrant women represents a pattern of abuse that destroyed dozens of lives over several years. Your testimony provides crucial evidence about his methods and motivations. The investigation that had led to Marcus's arrest had uncovered evidence of systematic criminal activity that went far beyond the smuggling operations Rebecca had discovered in their basement. Federal agents had documented forced labor arrangements that used marriage contracts to trap women in conditions approaching slavery. They had identified financial networks that laundered money through apparently legitimate businesses. Most disturbing, they had found evidence of violence against women who had attempted to escape situations similar to Rebecca's own experience. How many other women? Rebecca asked, though she suspected the answer would be difficult to hear. We've identified at least 37 potential victims over the past 5 years, Chen replied. Most are too frightened to testify, which makes your willingness to speak publicly crucial to our prosecution strategy. Without your testimony about Marcus's pattern of domestic abuse and control, we may not be able to establish the full scope of his criminal enterprise. The responsibility for representing 37 other women whose voices had been silenced by fear transformed Rebecca's understanding of why she had returned to Baltimore. This wasn't just about confronting her personal demons or ensuring her own safety. It was about speaking for people who couldn't protect themselves, using her survival to prevent others from experiencing similar victimization the weeks preceding. Marcus's trial allowed Rebecca to reconnect with aspects of her Baltimore life that had positive associations despite the trauma of her marriage. She visited the public library where she had planned her escape, expressing gratitude to librarians who had unknowingly facilitated her research into Western opportunities. She walked through neighborhoods where she had once lived in fear, observing how geographic locations could carry entirely different meanings depending on one's circumstances and emotional state. Most importantly, she met with other survivors of Marcus's criminal network, women who had escaped or been rescued but lacked the community support that had enabled Rebecca's remarkable recovery. Their stories revealed needs that existing social services weren't adequately addressing, creating opportunities for the kind of advocacy, work that could extend her impact far beyond individual testimony. The solution that emerged from these conversations drew on everything Rebecca had learned about community building. During her time at Bighorn Valley Ranch, working with Margaret, Chen and women's advocacy organizations, she began developing proposals for support networks that would treat trafficking survivors as capable individuals rather than helpless. Victims' recovery programs based on meaningful work and mutual support could provide alternatives to charity models that often reinforced feelings of powerlessness and dependence. Communities where survivors could develop job skills while maintaining relationships with others who understood their experiences offered possibilities for healing that traditional social services rarely achieved. Marcus Porter's trial began on a cold October morning in Baltimore's federal courthouse, where Rebecca would face her former husband across a courtroom for the first time since discovering the evidence that had forced her to flee Maryland. The woman who entered that courthouse bore no resemblance to the terrified wife who had once cowered in fear of Marcus's unpredictable violence. Rebecca Foster wore a navy dress that commanded respect rather than the shabby clothes she had worn during her escape. She carried herself with the dignity of someone who had found purpose in protecting others rather than the hunched posture of chronic victimization. Most importantly, she spoke with the clear voice of someone who understood that her words could prevent future crimes rather than the hesitant whispers of someone afraid to provoke retaliation. The testimony she provided over 3 days of examination and cross-examination was the most difficult thing Rebecca had ever done, but also the most necessary. She described Marcus's pattern of escalating abuse with clinical precision that left no doubt about his capacity for violence. She detailed the discovery of his criminal operations with accuracy that corroborated federal investigators' evidence. She explained her decision to flee with honesty that revealed both her desperation and her courage. But Rebecca's testimony went beyond personal victimization to address the broader implications of Marcus's criminal enterprise. Her 18 months of rebuilding her life had given her perspective on what recovery from trauma actually looked like, enabling her to describe not just what Marcus had done to her, but how women could overcome such experiences with appropriate support and opportunities. The defendant didn't just abuse individual women, Rebecca said during the most crucial moment of her testimony. He created systems designed to destroy our ability to trust our own judgment, make independent decisions, or imagine futures different from what he allowed us to have. Recovery required not just escaping his control, but learning to see ourselves as people with capabilities and worth that existed independently of his opinions. Marcus's reaction to seeing Rebecca transformed from victim to advocate revealed both his continuing capacity for rage and his frustrated recognition that she had developed strength he couldn't understand or intimidate. The woman he had expected to reclaim through legal manipulation had become someone who viewed his threats as obstacles to overcome rather than commands to obey. The defense attorney's cross-examination attempted to portray Rebecca as an unreliable witness whose testimony was motivated by revenge rather than justice. Questions about her current circumstances in Wyoming were designed to suggest that her new life had been built on deception and questionable decisions that undermined her credibility. Rebecca's responses revealed how completely her perspective had changed during her years of protecting others. She addressed hostile questioning with calm precision that never allowed emotion to compromise the factual accuracy of her testimony. Her accounts of building community at Bighorn Valley Ranch demonstrated transformation from victim to leader that contradicted attempts to portray her as someone driven by bitterness rather than justice. "I'm not testifying against the defendant because I want revenge," Rebecca replied to the defense attorney's most aggressive question. "I'm testifying because 15 children taught me that protecting people from predators is more important than protecting yourself from uncomfortable memories. The defendant destroyed many lives before mine and would continue destroying lives if he remained free to operate." The trial concluded with testimony from other survivors, federal investigators, and expert witnesses who placed Marcus's crimes in the broader context of human trafficking operations that victimized vulnerable populations throughout American cities. But Rebecca's testimony provided the personal foundation that enabled jurors to understand how individual abuse connected to systematic criminal enterprise. The verdict, delivered after 6 hours of deliberation, found Marcus Porter guilty on all 23 federal charges, including human trafficking, racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy. The judge's sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole ensured that Marcus would never again threaten Rebecca or any other woman. But the trial's conclusion wasn't the end of Rebecca's engagement with issues that had brought her back to Baltimore. The attention surrounding Marcus's prosecution had connected her with other survivors, social reformers and federal agencies investigating similar criminal operations throughout the country. Rebecca found herself invited to consult with law enforcement agencies about recognizing signs of domestic abuse that might indicate broader criminal activity. She advised social service organizations about developing programs that treated survivors as capable individuals rather than helpless victims. She spoke at conferences where her experience building community at Bighorn Valley Ranch provided models for recovery approaches that emphasized empowerment rather than charity. Most importantly, The trial had revealed the existence of other children trapped in institutional situations comparable to what the Bighorn Valley 15 had escaped. Territorial officials throughout the West were dealing with overcrowded facilities, inadequate funding, and administrative systems that often failed to serve children's actual welfare rather than bureaucratic convenience. The letters Rebecca received from social workers, territorial governors, and private citizens described situations where her expertise in community-based child welfare could address problems that conventional institutional approaches hadn't solved. Requests for consultation and advice came from throughout the American West, where population growth and social change were creating opportunities for innovative approaches to long-standing challenges. As autumn progressed toward winter, and Rebecca prepared to return to Wyoming, she realized that her journey to Baltimore had accomplished far more than providing testimony in a criminal trial. She had discovered that her personal transformation from victim to protector represented capabilities that could benefit people she had never met. In places she might never visit, the mail-order bride, who had fled Maryland seeking only personal safety, had become an advocate whose influence extended throughout multiple territories. The woman who had once defined herself entirely through someone else's abuse had developed expertise that could help reshape social policies, affecting thousands of vulnerable people. When Rebecca's train departed Baltimore Station for the return journey to Wyoming, she carried correspondence from dozens of organizations and officials who wanted to learn from the success she had achieved at Bighorn Valley Ranch. Her personal victory over Marcus Porter had revealed professional opportunities that could extend her impact far beyond the 15 children whose survival had first awakened her protective instincts. The journey westward provided time to process the complex emotions surrounding her return to the scene of her victimization and her emergence as someone whose voice carried authority in discussions about social reform. But mostly, Rebecca found herself eager to return to the community she had helped create, where 15 remarkable young people were probably managing ranch operations more efficiently than many adults could have achieved. Anna, Benjamin, Christopher, Rose, Helen, and all the others had taught her that strength wasn't measured by the absence of vulnerability, but by willingness to use whatever power you possessed to protect people who needed advocates. The lessons she had learned from them in Wyoming were now being applied to help other survivors throughout the country discover their own capabilities for building meaningful lives from the fragments of broken circumstances. The woman returning to Bighorn Valley Ranch was the same person who had left, but also someone whose understanding of her own purpose had expanded to encompass possibilities she had never imagined when she first heard desperate voices calling through a Wyoming blizzard. Rebecca's return to Bighorn Valley Ranch in late November revealed transformations that exceeded even her optimistic expectations about the children's capabilities during her absence. The operation she had left under Daniel and Anna's joint supervision had evolved into something more sophisticated and successful than what she had originally helped establish. The agricultural yields from their expanded vegetable operations had generated record income that enabled the ranch to retire remaining debts while investing in equipment, improvements that would increase future productivity. The workshop productions had developed markets throughout Wyoming territory and beyond, with orders from Colorado mining camps and Nebraska settlements that valued their reputation for reliable quality. But the most significant changes were evident in the children themselves. 3 months of increased responsibility had accelerated their development in ways that conventional education or traditional family arrangements rarely achieved. Anna had evolved from survival leader into a ranch manager whose organizational abilities surpassed those of many adults twice her age. Benjamin and Christopher had developed expertise in agricultural innovation that made them sought after consultants for neighboring operations, even the youngest. Children had gained confidence and practical skills that promised bright futures, regardless of what circumstances they might encounter as adults. Rose Martinez, now fully recovered from both her fever and broken wrist, had become an accomplished seamstress whose textile work commanded premium prices from customers who appreciated fine craftsmanship. The Sullivan twins had developed mechanical abilities that enabled them to repair and maintain complex equipment that kept ranch operations running efficiently. "Miss Rebecca," Anna said during their reunion conversation, using the respectful address that had become a permanent fixture regardless of changing circumstances. "We missed having you here, but we also discovered capabilities we didn't know we possessed. Managing everything ourselves taught us that we're ready for greater responsibilities than we previously imagined." The comment reflected maturity that went beyond practical accomplishments to encompass psychological development that would serve them throughout their adult lives. These young people had learned to make complex decisions, solve unexpected problems, and coordinate collective efforts without depending on adult authority to provide solutions or resolve conflicts. Daniel's assessment of their performance during Rebecca's absence revealed his growing understanding of what these remarkable individuals could achieve when treated as capable partners rather than dependent children. "They didn't just maintain operations while you were gone," he told Rebecca during a private conversation about ranch business. "They improved systems, increased efficiency, and generated more income than we've ever seen. Most importantly, they did it while maintaining the community relationships that make this place special." But Rebecca's return also coincided with new challenges that would test everything they had built together. The success of their unconventional household arrangement had attracted attention from federal officials who were investigating child welfare policies throughout Western territories, leading to opportunities that could extend their impact while creating responsibilities that none of them had anticipated. The letter from the Department of the Interior arrived in December, signed by Commissioner of Indian Affairs Thomas Morgan and addressed to Rebecca Foster as someone whose expertise in community-based child welfare could address problems that conventional, institutional approaches hadn't solved. The federal government was seeking consultation about establishing reservation schools that would serve Native American children more effectively than existing boarding school systems that had proven both expensive and counterproductive. "Mrs. Foster," the official correspondence explained, "your success in creating educational and economic opportunities for formerly institutionalized children has been documented in reports from multiple territorial officials. We believe your approach might provide models for addressing similar challenges in Native American education, where current policies have failed to produce desired outcomes while creating significant administrative costs." The consultation request represented recognition that Rebecca's work at Bighorn Valley Ranch had implications extending far beyond their specific circumstances. Federal policymakers were beginning to understand that community-based approaches might address long-standing problems more effectively than institutional solutions that separated children from family relationships and cultural connections. But accepting the consultation role would require Rebecca to travel extensively throughout Western territories, visiting reservation communities and working with tribal leaders to develop educational programs that respected Native American cultures while providing practical skills that would serve children in an increasingly complex modern world. Anna's response to this new opportunity revealed the depth of character development that had occurred during Rebecca's absence. Rather than viewing federal consultation work as something that would take Rebecca away from their ranch community, she saw it as natural extension of the protective instincts that had brought them all together. "You saved 15 children by helping us build something better than what we were running from," Anna said during their discussion about the federal consultation offer. "If you can help other children in different circumstances, then this work represents the same principles that guided everything we've done. Here, Benjamin and Christopher supported Anna's perspective by proposing ways that Bighorn Valley Ranch could serve as a training center for people who wanted to learn community-based approaches to child welfare. Their workshops and agricultural operations could demonstrate practical techniques, while their educational systems could provide models for programs that treated children as capable individuals rather than problems to be managed. The decision to accept federal consultation, responsibilities while maintaining their ranch operations, required careful planning that would preserve what they had built while extending their impact to benefit other vulnerable populations. Rebecca would spend several months each year traveling to reservation communities, working with tribal educators and federal administrators to develop programs that combined cultural preservation with practical skill development. During her consultation travels, Bighorn Valley Ranch would continue operating under the collective leadership that had proven so successful during her previous absence. Anna, Benjamin, Christopher, and the other older children had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded what most adults achieved in similar positions. Their continued development would benefit from increased responsibilities while providing ongoing proof that community-based approaches could produce remarkable results. The first consultation assignment took Rebecca to the Pine Ridge Agency in South Dakota, where Lakota children were struggling in boarding schools that separated them from families and cultural traditions while failing to provide education that would serve them effectively in either traditional or modern contexts. The situation presented challenges that were both similar to and different from what she had encountered with the Riverside escapees. Like the children at Bighorn Valley Ranch, Native American students faced institutional systems that treated them as problems to be solved rather than individuals with capabilities and cultural knowledge that deserved respect. But unlike the ranch children, these young people weren't separated from their families by abandonment or abuse, but by federal policies that deliberately destroyed family relationships in misguided attempts to force cultural assimilation. The solution Rebecca developed with tribal leaders and progressive federal administrators combined elements that had proven successful at the ranch with approaches that honored Native American traditions and family structures, rather than removing children from their communities for distant boarding school education. They established day schools that allowed students to return home each evening while receiving practical training that would serve them in an increasingly complex world. The curriculum integrated traditional knowledge about agriculture, craftsmanship, and natural resource management with modern techniques that could improve economic opportunities for entire tribal communities. Children learned both traditional methods of food preservation and modern canning techniques that could extend their families' nutrition security. They studied both ancestral stories and contemporary literature that would help them navigate relationships with non-native populations. Most importantly, the program treated Native American children as cultural resources who possessed valuable knowledge rather than blank slates who needed to abandon their heritage to succeed in modern America. Their educational experience built upon tribal wisdom, while adding capabilities that would help them protect and strengthen their communities. The success of the Pine Ridge program attracted attention from other reservations and federal agencies, leading to requests for similar consultation work throughout the West. Rebecca found herself traveling to Navajo communities in Arizona, Shoshone reservations in Idaho, and Cheyenne settlements in Montana, adapting her community-based approach to diverse cultural contexts while maintaining core principles that treated children as capable individuals, deserving of respect and opportunity. Each consultation assignment taught Rebecca new approaches to community building that she could apply to improve operations at Bighorn Valley Ranch. Native American traditions of collective decision-making enhanced the democratic processes she had established with the children. Traditional knowledge about sustainable agriculture improved their farming techniques, while reducing dependence on outside inputs. Most importantly, tribal emphasis on intergenerational relationships provided models for connecting their community with neighboring families and broader regional networks. The ranch's evolution during Rebecca's consultation travels reflected the children's continued growth into young adults whose capabilities extended far beyond what institutional care typically produced. Anna had begun corresponding with women's educational organizations about establishing programs that would prepare other young women for leadership roles in frontier communities. Benjamin and Christopher were developing agricultural innovations that could benefit ranchers throughout Wyoming territory. The Sullivan twins had invented mechanical improvements for wool processing equipment that attracted interest from textile manufacturers throughout the region. Rose and Helen Martinez had established a cooperative business relationship with Native American women who taught them traditional dyeing techniques in exchange for training in modern textile production methods. But perhaps the most significant development was the ranch's emergence as an informal training center for people who wanted to learn community-based approaches to social challenges. Teachers, social workers, territorial administrators, and private citizens began visiting Bighorn Valley Ranch to observe their operations and learn techniques they could apply in their own circumstances. The visitors came seeking practical knowledge about managing diverse groups, resolving conflicts democratically, integrating education with productive work, and creating communities where individual capabilities were developed rather than suppressed. What they discovered was a functioning example of social organization that challenged conventional assumptions about authority, education, and human potential. Rebecca's dual role as ranch coordinator and federal consultant had transformed her from someone seeking personal security into a recognized expert whose influence extended throughout Western territories. Letters arrived regularly from officials, educators, and social reformers who wanted her advice about addressing problems that conventional approaches hadn't solved. But the most meaningful recognition came from the children themselves, now young, adults whose achievements validated every assumption she had made about their potential. Ina had been accepted to the University of Wyoming on academic scholarships she had earned through her ranch education. Benjamin had received offers to manage agricultural operations for several major ranches that recognized his innovative techniques and leadership abilities. Christopher had been invited to join a federal survey team that would map and assess agricultural potential throughout newly opened territories. The Martinez sisters had established a textile business that employed other women from nearby settlements while maintaining their residence at the ranch. The Sullivan twins were developing mechanical inventions that could revolutionize equipment used throughout the agricultural industry. Most remarkably, all 15 maintained their commitment to community principles that had preserved them during their darkest circumstances. They had created chosen family relationships that transcended biological connections while developing individual capabilities that would serve them throughout their lives. The third anniversary of their rescue from the collapsed cabin site became an occasion for reflection on transformations that exceeded anything Rebecca had imagined when she first heard desperate voices calling through a Wyoming blizzard. The terrified children buried in snow had become confident young adults whose achievements demonstrated what was possible when vulnerable people received appropriate support and opportunities. But the anniversary also marked Rebecca's recognition that her work at Bighorn Valley Ranch represented something larger than rescuing 15 specific individuals. Their success had created a model for community-based approaches to social challenges that could benefit thousands of other vulnerable people who needed advocates and alternatives to institutional solutions. The ranch had evolved from a refuge for desperate children into a demonstration site that proved alternative approaches to child welfare, education, and community organization could produce superior results compared to conventional methods. Their experience provided evidence that supported policy changes affecting how societies addressed problems of abandonment, institutional abuse, and social marginalization. Rebecca's consultation work was extending their influence to Native American education, women's employment opportunities, agricultural innovation, and social reform movements that were gaining political traction throughout the American West. Their local success was contributing to regional and national conversations about how to address social challenges more effectively while respecting individual dignity and cultural diversity. As winter settled over Bighorn Valley Ranch and the fourth year of their community began, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought them from desperate survival to recognized leadership in social innovation. The mail-order bride, who had fled Maryland seeking only personal safety, had become someone whose work influenced policy discussions in territorial capitals and federal offices. The 15 children who had nearly died in a Wyoming blizzard had become young adults whose capabilities and character would contribute to building more just and effective communities throughout their lifetimes. Their individual achievements represented collective success that validated principles of community organization based on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and recognition of human potential that conventional institutions often failed to develop. But perhaps most importantly, their experience had demonstrated that transformation from victim to advocate was possible for anyone willing to accept responsibility for protecting others who needed support and opportunities. The strength they had discovered through survival had become the foundation for building something larger and more lasting than personal security. The woman who had once been buried beneath Marcus Porter's abuse had learned to help others emerge from circumstances that seemed hopeless. The children who had once been trapped in institutional exploitation had become advocates for other vulnerable populations who needed alternatives to systems that treated them as problems rather than people with remarkable potential. 5 years after Rebecca Foster first heard desperate voices calling through a Wyoming blizzard, she stood before the United States Congress in Washington, D.C., testifying about child welfare reforms that had been inspired by the success of Bighorn Valley Ranch. The woman addressing lawmakers bore no resemblance to the terrified refugee who had once fled Baltimore, with nothing but forged papers and desperate hope. Rebecca's testimony was part of congressional hearings examining federal policies toward vulnerable children throughout American territories, where traditional institutional approaches had proven both expensive and ineffective. The evidence she presented drew on data from dozens of consultation projects, hundreds of site visits, and thousands of children whose lives had been transformed through community-based alternatives to institutional care. Honorable members of Congress, Rebecca began her formal presentation. 5 years ago, I discovered 15 children buried alive in Wyoming snow, survivors of an institutional system that treated them as disposable labor rather than human beings with remarkable potential. Today, those same individuals are university students, successful entrepreneurs, agricultural innovators, and community leaders whose achievements validate every assumption about what becomes possible when we treat vulnerable people as capable individuals deserving of respect and opportunity. The statistical evidence she presented was compelling enough to influence federal policy. But the personal stories were what moved lawmakers to consider fundamental changes in how America addressed problems of child abandonment, institutional abuse, and social marginalization. Edna Kowalski had graduated from the University of Wyoming with honors and established a women's educational foundation that served frontier communities throughout the West. Benjamin Torres had revolutionized agricultural techniques that were being adopted by ranchers across multiple territories. Christopher Adams had joined the U.S. Geological Survey, where his innovations in land assessment were contributing to scientific understanding of Western development potential. But beyond individual achievements, Rebecca's testimony emphasized the broader implications of their community-based approach for addressing social challenges that conventional institutions had failed to solve. The success of Bighorn Valley Ranch and similar programs had demonstrated that vulnerable populations possessed capabilities that could contribute to economic development, social stability, and cultural progress when given appropriate opportunities and support. The congressional hearings concluded with bipartisan support for legislation that would redirect federal funding from institutional approaches toward community-based alternatives that had proven more effective while costing significantly less than traditional methods. The Territorial Child Welfare Reform Act of 1895 established funding mechanisms that would enable communities throughout the American West to develop programs modeled on principles that had first been tested in a remote Wyoming valley. But Rebecca's influence extended beyond policy changes to encompass broader social reform movements that were gaining momentum throughout the United States. Women's suffrage organizations sought her consultation about developing leadership training programs. Labor reform activists wanted her advice about creating worker cooperatives that could provide alternatives to exploitative industrial employment. Social settlement movements requested guidance about establishing community centers that could serve immigrant populations more effectively than existing charity models. The ranch itself had evolved from refuge for 15 desperate children into a recognized training center where hundreds of people came annually to learn community organizing techniques, educational methods, and economic development strategies that could address various social challenges. Visitors included territorial governors, university professors, religious leaders, and international observers who wanted to understand how American frontier communities were developing innovative approaches to social organization. The 15 children who had taught Rebecca about survival had grown into adults who were teaching new generations about the difference between existing and flourishing, between escaping danger and creating safety for others who still needed rescue from systems that treated them as disposable rather than invaluable. As winter approached and another season of guardian angel work began, Rebecca smiled at the knowledge that somewhere other voices might be calling through storms, waiting for someone to notice their situation and care enough to start digging. She had learned that the most important discoveries often came not from seeking treasure, but from responding to desperate need with whatever capabilities desperation had forced you to develop. The mail-order bride's heart had indeed stopped when she saw tiny hands in snow. But what she did next had saved not just 15 lives, but hundreds of others who found hope through the community. Those 15 remarkable individuals had helped her build from the fragments of their shared survival. Their legacy continued growing with each person who learned that transformation from victim to advocate was not only possible, but represented the highest purpose that could emerge from the deepest suffering. The guardian angels of tomorrow were being forged today in the fires of their own challenges, preparing to answer voices that would call through future storms, seeking someone strong enough and caring enough to help them discover what became possible when survival transformed into service to others who needed rescue from whatever threatened to bury them alive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.